Today's reading comes from the book of John, chapter 14, verses 15 through 21. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, who the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come for you. Yet a little while, the world will see me no more, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him.
That text in John gives the Holy Spirit a name. The Greek word that's used here is paraclete. It's sometimes translated as comforter or helper. It means one who comes alongside, somebody that comes alongside us. So you can see how helper or comforter might be a good translation for that. I think advocate also is a good translation when you think about how the Holy Spirit differs from Satan. Satan, we've learned, is the accuser. It's the accusatory voice that hurls accusations against people. It hurled them against Jesus. It hurls them against us. But the advocate, in modern terms, and also in the sense of the word paraclete, means somebody that's an advocate for the defense, or somebody that comes to our aid, comes to alongside us to assist us. Most TV crime dramas that we see on television today, and even I've been thinking about ones in the past, are written from the perspective of either the police or the perspective of the prosecutors who work with the police to accuse people of their wrongdoing and work what's called justice on behalf of the victims. Here's just a few of the crime dramas that you're probably familiar with. You might be Hawaii Five-0, CSI, The Shield. Inspector Lewis is a British one. I have to throw that in for Vandy because she loves those British crime dramas. Columbo is an old one. He was a police officer, of course, a detective. NCIS, there's a variety of different ones in that franchise. Criminal Minds, Sherlock, CSI New York, and of course all of the different Law and Order series. The thing that these all have in common is that they're either written from the perspective of the police or from the prosecutors or from both. You know, like in Law and Order, you get to see the perspective of the police first, usually as they discover the crime, and then the prosecuting attorneys are brought in to make a case against who they determine to be the criminal. So this means that they're all seeking to find the guilty party and incarcerate the guilty party, get them out of society. In all these programs, the defense attorneys are often depicted as the unscrupulous ones. They're the ones that are morally on the high ground, intent on getting the criminals incarcerated. And the defense attorneys, on the other hand, are oftentimes depicted as less than virtuous. They're often depicted as the ones that are defending the indefensible, defending people that shouldn't be defended. So all of these shows here and many others are written from the perspective, we could say, of the accusers, the perspective of the people that accuse those others that are considered to be criminals. We don't often think of it that way, as them being accusers, but that's, in one sense, you can think of it that way. They are certainly doing a good for society. They're trying to get dangerous people out of society as a whole, so they don't injure either themselves or other people. And I think there's a valid point to be made for that. But it's interesting to me that there are very few crime dramas that are written from the perspective of either the defense attorney or the perspective of the accused person. There's one that came to mind right off. It's an old one though, Perry Mason. If you remember the Perry Mason show, Raymond Burr played Perry Mason. He was a defense attorney who would take on cases in which he believed the accused was innocent. So here's a defender, an advocate for the accused, and he took their case up. The TV series ran on CBS from 1957 through 1966, and after that, an additional 30 TV movies were made and aired on NBC, running all the way up through 1995, and many of these are in reruns on cable or on satellite TV now. So it was a very successful franchise. Can you guys think of any others? Any other crime dramas that are written from the perspective of either the accused or from the perspective of the defense attorneys who are defending the accused? Anybody think of any others? Hearing nothing else, then we'll move forward. We're in the courtroom. Hearing no objections. So I think that's just interesting that the overwhelming majority of crime dramas on television are written from the perspective of the police and the prosecuting attorneys. This is the only one I could think of. I mean, some kind of cross the line. They have both perspectives in there. But I don't know if this means that the producers of TV crime dramas don't think there's an audience for shows written from the perspective of the accused and the defense attorney, although you could point to Perry Mason and say that was a very successful series written from that perspective. But I also wonder what the effect might this have on the viewing public. If you like crime dramas or mysteries, what is the effect that this imbalance, you might say, might have on the viewing public? In other words, whenever you think of crime dramas, you're going to think of that long list that I showed on that first slide, or others like them, and probably not the first thing that'll come to mind is Perry Mason, because it's been a long time, even though it's been out of circulation. So that tells me that there's a heavy slant in crime dramas toward justice from the perspective of the accusers. Then you have to ask, what is the slant that the Bible takes on life in general and on crime? We've noted that the Bible is the only ancient text that often takes the side of the accused person, often takes the side of the victims. Places like the imprecatory Psalms, the Exodus story, where Israelite comes, the nation of Israel comes out of captivity in Egypt, the exile stories when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon and in Assyria, and even the story of Jesus in the gospel accounts. These are all stories told from the perspective of the accused. They'd be more like a Perry Mason episode than a CSI episode, in other words. The last night, this text that we read, that Joanne read for us, was from the last night that Jesus lived with his disciples before he went to the cross. And he said this in this text: "If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever." So Jesus, I think, is recognizing just in this statement that followers of his are likely to be considered criminals, to be considered not in alignment with society as a whole. They're going to be considered marginalized people, and that they're going to need an advocate for their defense. And it's interesting that he says, "I'll send you another advocate." Well, who was the first advocate? Who was the first one that he was talking about? I think it was him. He, all through his life, had been an advocate for the poor, for the infirm, for those that society thought God had cursed, for outcasts of all kinds, for women. He was an advocate for minorities. He was an advocate for Samaritans and Gentiles. In other words, race and class distinctions didn't concern him. He was an advocate for people who were all bound up with their demons. You know, we use that phrase today in a different way maybe than we think about it being used in the New Testament. But we say that guy struggles with his demons, or that guy struggles. but I think there's some similarity to that. So Jesus was an advocate for all of those different groups of people: poor, infirmed, women, outcasts, minorities, different races, different classes. And he says, I will send you another one, another advocate, another comforter, another helper. Just notice, though, that none of those names for the Holy Spirit sound like prosecutor or accuser. They're all different. They're all from the other side of the courtroom, if you will, right? The Holy Spirit, then, is not an advocate for the prosecution. The Holy Spirit is an advocate for the accused. The Holy Spirit is an advocate for the defense, not for the prosecution. So that leads me to ask, how come so many of our churches are so accusatory in nature? So many of our churches play the role of the prosecuting attorney. They come and point out everything that they consider wrong with everything that's going on in the world, hurl accusations at them, and you could take what I'm saying right now as an accusation, that I'm accusing other churches of being accusers, but I'm going to try to do it gently and just as a point of reference, that in the same way Jesus, you could say, accused the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but in his dealing with them, he wasn't really accusing them in a negative sense. He was trying to open up their understanding that you guys have become way too narrow, way too colloquial in your understanding of God and of the Scriptures in general. So he says, I'm leaving you a new commandment, or new commandments. What were those? Well, he had just told them this one a few minutes earlier. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So Jesus had already answered this question before. What is this great commandment? And we see it in I think all of the Gospels, but here's the Matthew take on it. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said, you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. These are the commandments Jesus asks us to obey to give us access to the advocate. These are the commandments Jesus is asking us to obey. He says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, and I'll send you another advocate. So the keeping of the commandments is associated with the advocate coming alongside us. It's not that he's not going to come alongside us if we don't keep the commandments. It's just that I think it works much better though if we cooperate with the Holy Spirit than if we resist the Holy Spirit and act like a prosecuting attorney. So these commandments, loving God and loving neighbor, put us in solidarity with the Holy Spirit. It puts us in the same direction, or points us in the same direction, gets us on the same track as the Holy Spirit is on, the advocate. So I have about a 20-minute movie to watch today. It's called Redemption of the Prosecutor. I think I may have talked a little bit about Preston Shipp's story here before, but it's been a while, and I don't believe we've watched this movie. But it's the story of a guy named Preston Shipp, and he was the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. His job was to write opinions for the appellate court. Now, the appellate court is where criminals make appeals, either because they've been convicted of something and they want the court to take another look at it, or there's a whole other area of appellate law where people that have already been convicted and they're serving their sentences in prison will send requests to the appellate court asking them to consider or reconsider either their parole or their release dates. So this is what his job was. His job was, as Assistant Attorney General, to consider all of these appellate situations where people were asking either for a retrial or prisoners were asking that their case be looked at again to see if the court will allow them to be released early or given parole, those sort of things. He's a Christian man, had been a Christian since he was a young man. but he began to struggle with his professional career as a prosecutor, as an accuser, because he started to think of his job not in a vacuum, or not compartmentalized like many of us do. Sometimes we're very, as humans, able to compartmentalize the things that we do in our life. And we can make sense of something in one compartment that, if we were really to put it side by side with what we confess about God, might raise some questions. And this is just the dilemma that Preston came up against. He was teaching courses at a local college, and they started doing a combined legal law course with students in the college and people in the local prison, in the women's prison. So half of the students they would go to the prison to conduct the class, and half the students would be prisoners. The other half would be students from the local college. And in this process, he started to meet some of these people that he had written opinions on, and kept them in prison. And so this is kind of his story. So let's just watch this, and then we'll talk about this after, in the context of the advocate being the Holy Spirit, and how should the Holy Spirit, as advocate for the accused or advocate for the defense, impact how we think about our own lives, and how are there any conflicts that this arises, like did arise with Preston. So here we go.
My name is Preston Shipp, and for several years I served as an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. And it was my job to argue in court that someone who had been convicted of a crime and sentenced to time in prison, that needed to be affirmed on appeal, that what had happened was exactly what needed to happen. I hold Jesus in the highest esteem, and I care a great deal about the church and what the church is called to do and to be. How can I reconcile the job I was being asked to do as a prosecutor with my faith in Jesus, who came proclaiming release for prisoners? I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. I've lived in Nashville just about my entire life.
Law enforcement and things like that has always been very much a part of who he was. He really did watch a lot of Miami Vice.
I really gravitated to that world because it was so exciting. You had good guys and bad guys. You know, you had good guys who were wearing the white hats and they were trying to make the world safer. Then in college, I had an internship with the Nashville prosecutor's office. These are the folks who are telling law enforcement officers what to do. They were just so sharp and so educated and so in control. And I thought, I need to go be a prosecutor.
I met Preston at Lipscomb University. We started dating in the fall. By April, he proposed. But we decided that June to marry. Our kids came along very quickly. Lila, age 8, Ruby, age 6, and Levi, 3.
It was a whirlwind.
Seems to have worked so far. We've been married almost 14 years. I remember after he graduated from law school, when he was accepted into the Supreme Court, he felt very proud to be successful in what he'd always wanted to do.
I felt like, this is exactly God's will for my life. I was going to be a career prosecutor, make the move into becoming a judge. I had my whole career mapped out.
My dad's name is Preston Shipp. He does law. I think he was working as an executor for a judge.
You mean a prosecutor?
I guess so.
I met Preston when we were working together at the Attorney General's office.
When a defendant appeals, we would get essentially written transcripts and copies of exhibits, which would be photographs, sometimes videos, audio recordings and things. 99% of the time you are not going to have a defendant in the courtroom. Appellate prosecutors are dealing strictly with paper.
In the 4 years that I worked there, I think I did 300 cases, 250, 300 briefs.
And it does get to be almost like an assembly line feeling. You have a role to vindicate society. You have a role to vindicate the interests of the victims.
And that's how you sleep at night. You are 100% sure you're doing the right thing all the time. And you're 100% sure that they are deserving of whatever punishment they've received.
The easy way to do the job is to overemphasize the negative.
When the only information that you receive about a person is the worst thing that they've ever done, you can fall into the trap of regarding them as less than human.
I got involved in prison ministry when Preston was just a very small baby. I don't know that I ever really told him that this was important. I think he just observed that I felt that it was important, and then he started going with me occasionally after he turned 18.
I think he's always had a heart for service and for serving people, and that felt natural to him to be a part of the prison ministry at our church.
Y'all know the reason why I go out there, right? Is because, those guys...
They can't have worship services
they can't go to church. And we go out there and we talk about the Bible and we say prayers and we sing songs, but the point of all of that is to let them know that we love them, God loves them.
We really, really want our family to be a family that takes Christianity very seriously. I feel like every aspect of our lives has to be shaped by our beliefs and our faith.
It never occurred to me that there might be, a conflict of interest that would cause Preston some angst down the road because of his concern for incarcerated people.
As a lot of us do, he compartmentalized a lot of his life, and this is what I do at church, and then this is what I do at work, and this is what I do at home, and none of those things affected the other.
Things started to unravel for me when I started actually teaching college classes out at the prison.
We take courses that would normally meet on campus and we relocate those to the Tennessee Prison for Women. One of the things we wanted to do pretty early on with the LIFE program was to raise questions about criminal justice.
There's a big difference in studying criminal justice just within the safe walls of academia. Something else to do it at a prison where half the class is intimately familiar with the process.
Initially, the dynamic in the classroom was just fear. The outside students, all the stereotypes, everything that they had seen in the media was on their mind. And so they were afraid. They were going into a prison. What was going to happen?
One of the students from campus got to the parking lot of the prison, saw the razor wire, and never got out of their car. Turned right around and just drove back to campus, just like, forget it. The inmates were scared to death because they didn't know whether they could do the college work. They had almost zero confidence in their ability to do the work. So we would take breaks during the class, extended breaks, so that they could talk about the television shows that they watch and the music that they listen to. I really thought it was important for them to see that they're not that different. One of the shortcomings of traditional prison ministry is that it's sort of a one-way street. It's mostly people from the outside coming in and talking or preaching or praying or reading or singing or whatever. And so you don't hear a whole lot from the people that you're going in there to be with. Once I went in there and started teaching, and we created that space for dialogue, then I started hearing stories. Centoya Brown was one of my best students. She was serving time for homicide that she had committed when she was 16 years old. And by the time I got to know her, she had already served several years in prison.
Centoya?
Yeah.
Hey, it's Preston.
Hi, Preston.
We're gonna put you on speakerphone so that we can hear you.
Preston was my teacher
of the first class, I thought he was just going to be an arrogant jerk, like what I felt most prosecutors would be. But the first night of class, even though I think maybe everybody was feeling that way, it turned out to be completely different. Like, the people are just really great, and they're really accepting.
And during the breaks and before and after class, we got to know each other.
We talk about your obsession with Star Wars. We talk about, what do we talk about?
Oh, we talk about books. I mean, come on,
we talk about books.
Yeah.
We got to be friends.
He just didn't talk like the kind of person I thought he was going to be. He's cool. I mean, kind of.
It's okay, it's okay.
And I noticed that Preston and Centoya, they just sort of had an ability to communicate in a way perhaps that was unique or special.
The system was dealing with a 16-year-old, and it didn't recognize the enormous potential that she had. And we know that kids have potential to change. We know that physiologically they are different from adults. Psychologically they're different from adults. But it had no regard for Centoya's potential. It just viewed her as, at 16 she did this, and therefore she is disposable. And threw away this person who has so much to offer. That's right in line, I think, with what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, when he says, when you go to a prison and you visit someone, that's what you're doing for me. That alternative vision of community, I think, is at the core of the gospel.
Preston is first and foremost a person of faith. He is a Christian. It is who Preston is. This experience confronted him. Can we, on one day during our week, talk about and celebrate grace, and the rest of the week then be agents of retribution? And that question kind of hit him cold.
I could tell that he was beginning to be affected by the work because he would come home a little depressed.
I'm sure that it manifested itself in ways that I might not have been mindful of.
He was very quiet. He was withdrawn. He would kind of be easily frustrated with the kids.
I felt trapped, and it was a very desperate feeling. Like, how in the world can I write one more brief when I feel the way that I do?
He really, really wanted to quit, but he couldn't. He realized that he had a family to provide for at this point. It was definitely a stressful time in our relationship with each other as well.
The deeper I got, the worse it got. And the better I got to know the women, the more hypocritical I felt. There's a lot about Centoya's life that I did not know. Mother had abandoned her. For the 2 weeks leading up to her crime, she had been subjected to sexual abuse several times. She was living with a pimp who was abusing her. She was afraid. She was 16. And this man, who was twice her age, took her to his house. It was a prostitution deal. He was bragging about how many guns he had, and she was afraid of him.
I thought he was reaching for guns. I'm like, oh shit, you know what I'm saying? That's what he's doing. He was gonna murder me or rape me or something.
Yeah. And then what did you do?
I shot him.
I always assumed that these are autonomous individuals. They had free will and they just decided to break the law. And once I got into the prison and started hearing their stories, it's like, no, these are people who were in a bad situation. And I can't say that I would have acted any differently.
It was strange for me to see him have such a change, to go from being very enthusiastic and encouraged and excited and proud to being very depressed, concerned, disappointed, and confused.
I was like, I never should have been in this. This is a system that is opposed to what I've come to understand the gospel to be. Why in the world did I labor in that system for years? I felt like a huge hypocrite.
We needed him to kind of plug back into things around the house and to be a little more stable when he was around.
It took 2 years for me to figure out how to get out of that situation. I left the AG's office altogether. I was so happy. I was like, well, finally, you know, I'm no longer a prosecutor. I don't have to feel hypocritical anymore. Yeah, I thought it was great. Whenever the Court of Criminal Appeals or the Supreme Court issues its opinion in a case, you know, where I was the appellate prosecutor, even after I left the AG's office, I would get a copy of the opinion. The court clerk would send me a copy of the opinion. And I got a copy of an opinion in the mail, which was not unusual. Open it up, and it's got Centoya's name on it, Centoya Denise Brown. I had been the assistant AG who had argued that she needed to serve a life sentence in prison.
I think it broke his heart.
When you read the transcript, you know, about the crime that Centoya committed, you know, it's a pretty one-sided story, you know. And the way that I wrote my brief was pretty one-sided. You know, I dealt with all her issues and said, no, this person took another person's life and she needs to go to prison for it, even though she was only 16 when it happened. To then find out that no, she's more than the worst thing she ever did. She's also this articulate, very smart, you know, funny student in my class. And, you know, you couldn't reconcile the two. I couldn't reconcile the two. How could that be the same person? And I knew that she was going to get a copy of the opinion.
The first thing, it was just like a snap kind of reaction. I just had really sat down to just really read through the opinion, and I looked and I saw his name, and I don't know, it just kind of threw me off. I kind of felt like I had this little haven with Lipscomb, you know, I didn't feel judged. Then when I realized he had a role in my case, and it was like I was in the courtroom with the prosecutors, with the judges all over again, I think I kind of felt betrayed.
You were the one that put her in prison.
Yeah.
It would be hard to, like, know that your teacher put you in prison. Like, really hurt them, and then you were supposed to be friends with them.
You know, I felt like I needed her to forgive me.
At the end of the semester party is when we were able to, that's when we were able to kind of sit down and hash it all out. Just the two of us.
I remember him saying like he couldn't really reconcile the two people, the Centoya and the banker box of records and the Centoya that he knew from class. Kind of reminded me that he was still my friend, he was still Preston, and I didn't have to worry about that. He didn't judge me, he did see me as a person. He didn't just see me as this thing that I had been charged with or all the horrible things that they've said about me. Well, I'm not going to be angry at Preston. No. I'll let Preston be my friend.
You have 10 seconds left on this call.
Bye.
What about those other 250 or 300 people that I argued that they needed to go to prison? Would I feel the same way about them? Would they be my friends? Would I feel compassion for them? And would I question the arguments that I made? Why did I ever feel comfortable making arguments about the fate of people I didn't know and had never met? This system that we have is broken. The way that we are incarcerating people at a rate that surpasses even China, it's not working. This mass incarceration is ruining families.
I believe our justice system is the best in the world. You know, I don't know if I was similarly situated that I would have felt a need to apologize necessarily. I just represent whoever my client is, whether it's the state or whether it's an individual. And that's where I fit in. And I think early on, that's where Preston fit in.
For so long, I felt like the system did what the system needed to do. So I think it was kind of a gradual change in me as well.
I felt like after talking to her that she had forgiven me for having been a prosecutor on her case.
I think he went not knowing what to expect, feeling like he was going to take something to the women in the prison. And he came home feeling like they had renewed his commitment to his faith. We want to be a family that is open to God's work. And I felt very much so like his hand was at work in this situation.
He's been on a long journey, and it's been enjoyable as a professor to watch him grow and mature.
How are we to live in a world where some people are viewed as disposable? And I think that the gospel makes certain demands on us, that we go to them, we're present to them, and we form community with them. You have to be willing to be among criminals the way that Jesus was. Be willing to leave the safety and the comfort of your pew and go find out what God is doing in other places. Half a mile away from where Centoya's crime occurred. I mean, that's where I grew up. You know, it all started at a Sonic restaurant less than probably half a mile away from where I grew up. But she wasn't part of my community. I think you have to be willing to regard other people as and we're the same, you know. And somehow my salvation is bound up with those people in prison. I am altogether convinced that that is true. Jesus is no longer around to do the work of God. That is up to us.
Are you happy? Are you happy? Are you happy? Are you happy now? 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 Are you happy now?
Brought you a nice light movie to watch this morning, huh? So, I think the statistics at the end are alarming. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. We say we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. As part of our founding identity, we're apparently not the land of the free. There are just this past week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions put an order out to all the federal prosecutors around the country to seek the maximum penalty possible in all of their cases. So this movie's a few years old, but this is alive and well. This issue is alive and well now. The book, The New Jim Crow, is very instructive on this. Michelle Alexander wrote that book. It traces the history of not just racism in the United States, going back to before the Civil War and up to the current time, but also how inequitable sentencing for different minority groups has been how we've perpetuated racism even after it became unconstitutional. You know, if you over-target a particular group of people, put more police in that place and encourage them to do more arrests, more prosecutions than you do in other neighborhoods and other groups of people, over a time, over a few years or a generation, you remove so many people from that community, especially young men, that you cause a lasting change in that community. You're not just affecting the criminal that you incarcerate. You're infecting the whole community. You're impacting the whole community that criminal came from, because you're putting his family at a disadvantage. When you have a large group of people with that have had the young, vital, working age people removed from that community, it handicaps that whole community. So you can just say, well, there's a lot of crime in that community, that's why we have to put a lot of police in there. But Alexander argues very convincingly that that's not what's going on. Just take cocaine for instance. Cocaine had been in widespread use across the country, but in middle and upper class environments for years before crack cocaine came along. Crack was just a cheaper version of cocaine that made it so it made this drug that was really too expensive for the lower income communities available to them. But the sentencing that was put in place for crack cocaine far exceeded the sentencing for powdered cocaine. So if you were arrested for using crack cocaine, your sentence was something ridiculous, like 30 times longer than if you'd been arrested in a middle or upper class community having powdered cocaine for the same amount of cocaine. So there are things done that aren't easily apparent to us that give us the idea that things are all okay and everything's fine and things are as they should be. But I'll just stop with that just as one example of how this works. And this story is not about drugs, at least not primarily. It's I'm sure there was drugs involved in the whole scenario, but it's about, and I think this is an important thing, if we make judgments about people based on the worst thing they've ever done, without consideration for the rest of their lives, that's how we get to this place, like this movie's talking about. It's how we get to locking up 16-year-old girls, not even being eligible for parole until she's 67, because the prosecuting environment just doesn't consider anything, for the most part, other than the worst thing they've ever done, other than the crime that they're facing. They don't consider the potential that this person could be rehabilitated, could be turned around, could be made into a functioning member of society, somebody that would be paying taxes into society rather than consuming taxes. And now, so this has become a major expense for the United States. 2.5 million people incarcerated. That a lot of our tax money goes to that, and because we don't, and because like the statistics showed, only 2% of them are being educated to be able to better themselves when they come out. We just perpetuate this thing over and over. So, all right. Any thoughts that you guys have?